the road less traveled. The highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the dense, gnarled forest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the road. Inside the beat-up sedan, the air was thick with tension. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his cocky smirk barely hiding the unease creeping into his voice. "Relax, Kira. It's just a shortcut. We'll be at the cabin before you can say serial killer." Kira shot him a glare, her fingers tightening around the cross necklace she always wore. Famous last words, Lucas. Why does this feel like the start of every horror movie ever? Jess, lounging in the back seat, rolled her eyes. "Because you watch too many of them. It's a dirt road, not a gateway to hell." Marco, sitting beside her, said nothing. His dark eyes scanned the forest outside, his brow furrowed. Something about the trees didn't sit right with him. Their twisted branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers, and the shadows between them felt alive. The car jerked violently, and a loud thud echoed through the cabin. The engine sputtered and died. "What the hell was that?" Lucas shouted, slamming his hands on the wheel. They all climbed out of the car, their breath visible in the chilly evening air. On the road ahead lay the source of the noise, a deer carcass, its body mangled and twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled around it, but the wounds were too precise, too surgical. Kira's voice was barely a whisper. "That's not normal. That's not natural." A low, guttural growl echoed from the woods. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the tree line. Jess tried to sound brave. "Probably just a coyote. Let's get back in the car." But as they turned, the car's headlights flickered and died. The growl grew louder, closer. Marco's voice was urgent. "Run. Now." Prologue. The road, less traveled, the highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the dense, gnarled forest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the road. Inside the beat-up sedan, the air was thick with tension. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his cocky smirk barely hiding the unease creeping into his voice. "Relax, Kira. It's just a shortcut. We'll be at the cabin before you can say serial killer." Kira shot him a glare, her fingers tightening around the crossed necklace she always wore. Famous last words, Lucas. Why does this feel like the start of every horror movie ever? Jess, lounging in the back seat, rolled her eyes. "Because you watch too many of them. It's a dirt road, not a gateway to hell." Marco, sitting beside her, said nothing. His dark eyes scanned the forest outside, his brow furrowed. Something about the trees didn't sit right with him. Their twisted branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers, and the shadows between them felt alive. The car jerked violently, and a loud thud echoed through the cabin. The engine sputtered and died. "What the hell was that?" Lucas shouted, slamming his hands on the wheel. They all climbed out of the car, their breath visible in the chilly evening air. On the road ahead lay the source of the noise, a deer carcass, its body mangled and twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled around it, but the wounds were too precise, too surgical. Kira's voice was barely a whisper. "That's not normal. That's not natural." A low, guttural growl echoed from the woods. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the tree line. Jess tried to sound brave. "Probably just a coyote. Let's get back in the car." But as they turned, the car's headlights flickered and died. The growl grew louder, closer. Marco's voice was urgent. "Run, now." The hunt begins. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the cracked asphalt. The growling creature was close behind, its breath hot and rancid. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes as if trying to trap them. Up ahead, an abandoned gas station loomed out of the darkness. Its windows were shattered and the walls were covered in graffiti. Lucas slammed the door shut behind them, and they pushed a rusted shelf against it. For a moment, there was silence. Jess leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. What the hell was that thing? Kira clutched her cross necklace, her eyes wide with fear. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Marco shone his phone light on the wall, revealing crude drawings, stick figures being torn apart, a horned creature, and the words, "The Hollowing," scrawled in blood. "We need to get out of here," Marco said quietly. "Now." But the growl returned, louder this time. The creature slammed against the door, cracking the wood. "Down there," Lucas shouted, pointing to a trapdoor in the floor. They scrambled down into the basement, the air thick with the stench of decay. The floor was littered with rusted tools and rotting furniture. In the corner, a pile of bones gleamed in the faint light. Kira gasped. "We're not alone down here." The trapdoor above them slammed shut. The basement, the creature, stood at the top of the stairs, its head tilted unnaturally. As it stared down at them, its elongated limbs twitched and its hollow eyes glowed faintly. "Join us," it rasped, its voice a distorted, guttural growl. Chaos erupted. Jess grabbed a crowbar and swung at the creature, but it caught the weapon and snapped it in half. Marco threw a rusted knife, which embedded itself in the creature's shoulder, but it didn't flinch. "Run! Just run!" Lucas screamed. They scattered, but the creature was faster. It grabbed Jess by the arm, its jagged teeth sinking into her shoulder. Blood sprayed across the room as she screamed. Kira and Marco fled through a narrow tunnel, Jess's screams echoing behind them. The ritual. The tunnel led to a cavern, its walls covered in strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie light. In the Center stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained with dried blood. Lucas was already there, frantically trying to decipher the symbols. It's a ritual. We have to stop it. The creature entered the cavern, dragging Jess's lifeless body behind it. It threw her onto the altar, and the symbols began to glow. Jess's body contorted, her skin splitting as something inside her tried to break free. Marco grabbed a rusty axe from the wall and charged at the creature. He swung wildly, severing one of its arms. Black ooze sprayed from the wound, but the bot creature didn't stop. It backhanded Marco, sending him crashing into the wall. Lucas grabbed a torch and threw it at the altar, setting Jess's body ablaze. The creature howled in rage, its form flickering. As the fire spread, Kira grabbed Marco's axe and swung at the creature, decapitating it in one brutal strike. Its body collapsed, but the head continued to snarl and snap. The survivor, Kira, stumbled out of the cavern, her body covered in blood and ash. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the forest. A passing truck stopped, and the driver helped her inside. "Are you okay? What happened?" the driver asked. Kira didn't answer. She stared out the window, her eyes hollow. In the reflection, her face flickered briefly, revealing the creature's glowing eyes. Somewhere in the forest, the growling began again. The hollowing wasn't over.
The Night of the Puppets. In the small, forgotten town of Raven's End, there was a shop tucked away in a shadowy alley. Its sign, faded and cracked, read Ezekiel's Oddities. The shop was filled with strange relics, cursed trinkets, and, most notably, a collection of antique puppets. These puppets were no ordinary toys. They were carved with unsettling precision, their glassy eyes seeming to follow you as you moved. The shopkeeper, an old man with a hunched back and a voice like gravel, would warn anyone who lingered too long. Some things are better left untouched, but warnings are meant to be ignored. The curious buyer. Elliot was a struggling artist with a fascination for the macabre. When he stumbled upon Ezekiel's Oddities, he was immediately drawn to the puppets. There were 6 of them, each more grotesque than the last. A hulking brute with rusted nails for teeth, a porcelain ballerina with a cracked face, a jester with a jagged grin, a surgeon holding blood-stained tools, a witch with hollow eyes, and a child with a stitched-up mouth. The shopkeeper eyed Elliot warily. "These are not for sale," he rasped. But Elliot, desperate for inspiration, offered a hefty sum. Reluctantly, the old man agreed, handing over the puppets with a final warning. "Do not wake them." The first night, Elliot placed the puppets on a shelf in his studio, admiring their craftsmanship. That night, he awoke to the sound of faint whispers. He followed the noise to his studio, where he found the puppets arranged in a circle, their heads tilted as if in conversation. Before he could react, the lights flickered, and the puppets turned to face him. The ballerina was the first to move. Her delicate hands twisted into claws as she lunged at Elliot, slicing his arm with a jagged, sharp porcelain. Blood sprayed across the room as the jester cackled, its voice a high-pitched screech. The surgeon followed, its scalpel glinting in the moonlight as it carved into Elliot's leg. He screamed, but the child puppet silenced him, its stitched mouth unraveling to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The strings of control. Elliot managed to escape, but the puppets weren't done with him. They hunted him through the house, their movements jerky yet unnervingly precise. The brute smashed through doors, its nail-studded mouth dripping with saliva. The witch chanted in a language Elliot couldn't understand, her hollow eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He realized too late that the puppets were not just alive. They were controlled by something far more sinister, thin, almost invisible. Strings extended from their bodies, leading up into the shadows of the sea. Something was pulling the strings, something that watched from the darkness with a malevolent grin. The master revealed. Elliot's final stand came in the attic. Cornered and bleeding, he grabbed a pair of scissors and severed the strings connecting the puppets. For a moment, they fell lifeless to the floor. But then the shadows stirred, and a figure emerged, a puppet unlike the others. It was tall and skeletal, its face a blank mask except for two glowing eyes. This was the marionette Small, the entity that had been controlling the others all along. It spoke in a voice that echoed with the scream of sunset. They are not. Before Elliot could react, the marionette's maw plunged its needle-like fingers into his chest, weaving strings into his flesh. He felt his body stiffen, his limbs moving against his will. The last thing he saw was his own hands reaching for the scissors, guided by the marionette's will. A new collection. The next morning, Ezekiel's oddities reopened. The shopkeeper placed a new puppet on the shelf, a lifelike figure of a man with wide, terrified eyes. The other puppets surrounded it, their glassy stares fixed on the newest addition to their collection. And in the shadows, the marionette's maw watched, its strings stretching out to ensnare the next curious soul.
The arrival, the Walker family, Fairy, a former dancer turned real estate agent, her husband Kareem, a struggling musician, and their two children, Brooklyn, a curious 12-year-old, and Terry, a mischievous 8-year-old, arrive in Atlantic City for a weekend getaway. They plan to enjoy the casinos, the beach, and the iconic boardwalk. But Fairy feels uneasy, haunted by a childhood memory she can't quite place. Years ago, as a little girl, Fairy visited Atlantic City with her parents. One night, she wandered off and found herself in an abandoned arcade beneath the boardwalk. There, she encountered a girl who looked exactly like her. Terrified, she ran away and never spoke of it again. Act 2. The Shadows. Emerge on their first night, the family explores the boardwalk. Brooklyn and Terry are fascinated by the carnival games and cotton candy, while Kareem tries his luck at the roulette table. Fairy, however, can't shake the feeling of being watched. As they return to their hotel, they notice strange figures lurking in the shadows. That night, the family is awakened by the sound of breaking glass. 4 intruders stand in their room, doppelgangers of the Walker family. These shadows are twisted, darker versions of themselves, dressed in tattered clothing and speaking in eerie, distorted voices. The leader, Red Fairy, steps forward and delivers a chilling message. It's our turn now. Act 3. The Battle for Survival. The walkers flee into the night, but the shadows are relentless. The family soon discovers that the doppelgangers are part of a larger group living beneath the boardwalk, in a labyrinth of tunnels and abandoned attractions. These shadows are the forgotten, those who were left behind by society, forced to live in the darkness while their counterparts thrived above. As the family fights to survive, Barry begins to piece together the truth. The shadows were created decades ago as part of a secret experiment by a powerful casino owner who sought to control the city's fate. The experiment went wrong, and the shadows were abandoned, left to fester in the underground. Now, they've risen to claim their place in the world. Act 4. The Final Confrontation. The climax takes place in the abandoned arcade beneath the boardwalk, where Fairy's childhood encounter occurred. The walkers face off against their shadows in a tense and emotional showdown. Red Fairy reveals that she was the girl Fairy met years ago, and she's been waiting for this moment ever since. In a shocking twist, Fairy realizes that the only way to stop the shadows is to confront her own guilt and fear. She makes a heartbreaking decision to sacrifice herself to save her family, allowing the shadows to take her place in the world above. As the shadows retreat, the walkers escape, forever changed by the ordeal. The new normal. The story ends with the walkers returning home, but things are different. Kareem notices Fairy acting strangely, and Brooklyn swears she sees her mother's shadow moving on its own. The final shot shows Red Fairy, now living as a Fairy, smiling faintly as she watches the sunset over the Atlantic City boardwalk.
The Hollowing. The town of Black Hollow had always been cursed. Nestled deep within the woods, it was a place where the trees grew too close together, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The townsfolk whispered of an ancient evil that slumbered beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to awaken. They called it the Hollowing, a force that consumed flesh and soul, leaving only emptiness behind. It began with the disappearances. First, a hunter vanished, his bloodied rifle found snapped in two near the edge of the woods. Then a young couple, their car abandoned on the side of the road, the interior smeared with something dark and sticky. The sheriff dismissed it as animal attacks. But the townsfolk knew better. They locked their doors at night and prayed to a God they weren't sure was listening. The first kill Maggie had always been a skeptic. She moved to Black Hollow to escape her past, renting a crumbling cabin on the outskirts of town. The locals warned her to stay away from the woods, but she laughed it off. Superstitious nonsense, she said. One night, she heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cutting through the thick fog. The growl grew louder, closer. Her heart pounded as she scanned the trees, her breath visible in the cold air. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its body twisted and malformed, as if it had been stitched together from the remains of its victims. Its face was a grotesque mask of rotting flesh, racing through the air. With a sickening whoosh, she stumbled back, but it was too fast. Its hand plunged into her chest, fingers wrapping around her heart. She felt it, a searing pain, as her ribs cracked and splintered. The creature yanked its hand free, her heart still beating in its grasp. Maggie collapsed, her lifeless eyes staring into the void. The spiral. The killings escalated. The creature, whatever it was, grew bolder, more brutal. It didn't just kill, it devoured. Victims were found, torn apart, their organs strewn across the forest floor, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Some were skinned alive, their flesh peeled away in ragged strips. Others were impaled on tree branches, their bodies twisted into grotesque sculptures. The townsfolk tried to fight back. They formed armed patrols, set traps, and even called in a priest to perform an exorcism. But nothing worked. The creature was unstoppable, its strength and speed beyond human comprehension. It seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every life it took. The truth. In the town's archives, an old journal was discovered. It belonged to a settler who had lived in Black Hollow centuries ago. The entry spoke of a ritual gone wrong, of a man who had tried to harness the power of the earth to achieve immortality. But the earth fought back, twisting him into something monstrous. The journal ended with a warning. The hollow cannot be killed. It is the earth itself, and it will never stop. The final stand. A group of survivors banded together, determined to end the nightmare. Armed with fire and blades, they ventured into the heart of the woods, where the creature was said to dwell. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the ground slick with blood. They found it in a clearing, feasting on the remains of its latest victim. The battle was brutal. The creature moved like a shadow, its claws slicing through flesh and bone with ease. One by one, the survivors fell, their screams echoing through the trees. But in the end, they managed to set it ablaze, the flames consuming its twisted form. As the fire died down, they thought it was over. But then the ground began to tremble, and a low, rumbling laugh filled the air. The creature emerged from the ashes, its body regenerating before their eyes. It wasn't just a monster, it was the land itself, and it would never die. The hollowing continues. The survivors fled, but the creature followed. It always followed. Black Hollow became a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes abandoned. But if you venture into the woods at night, you might hear it. The growl, the laughter, the sound of something hungry. And if you're unlucky, you might see it too, its glowing eye piercing the darkness, its jagged grin promising unspeakable horrors. Because the hollowing never stops. It waits, it watches, and it hungers.
The Curse of the Crimson Coin. In the decaying town of Blackwater, there was a legend whispered in the darkest corners of the local tavern. It spoke of a cursed coin, forged in blood and greed, said to grant unimaginable wealth to whoever possessed it. But the coin came with a price, a terrible, gruesome price. Those who spent it would suffer a fate worse than death, their bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. No one believed the legend until it fell into the hands of Victor Kane. The coin's arrival. Victor was a small-time crook with big-time dreams. He spent his days hustling tourists and his nights drowning his failures in cheap whiskey. One evening, as he stumbled home through the fog-shrouded streets, he tripped over something metallic. It was a coin, unlike any he'd ever seen. Its surface was a deep blood red, and etched into its face was the image of a screaming skull. Victor pocketed it, laughing off the superstitious nonsense he'd heard about cursed coins. But that night, he had a dream. A figure, cloaked in shadows, appeared, its voice a guttural rasp. "Spend it wisely, Victor. The coin demands payment in flesh." The first payment. The next morning, Victor woke to find his wallet stuffed with cash. Hundreds, thousands, more money than he'd ever seen. He laughed, thinking it was a miracle. But as he reached for the cash, his hand began to twitch. Then it burned. He screamed as his skin bubbled and peeled away, revealing raw, bleeding muscle beneath. The pain was excruciating, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. Victor stared at his hand, now a mangled, claw-like thing. The coin had claimed its first payment, the descent. Victor tried to get rid of the coin, but it always found its way back to him. He threw it into the river, buried it in the woods, even gave it to a homeless man. But it always reappeared in his pocket, cold and heavy. Meanwhile, his newfound wealth grew. He bought a mansion, expensive cars, and all the luxuries he'd ever dreamed of. But with every purchase, the coin took its toll. One night, after buying a diamond necklace for a woman he'd been courting, Victor's legs gave out. He collapsed, screaming, as his bones snapped and reformed into twisted animalistic limbs. His screams turned to gurgles as his jaw unhinged, his teeth elongating into jagged fangs. By morning, he was a monster, his humanity slipping away with every payment. The final deal. Desperate, Victor sought out the town's reclusive historian, an old woman named Agatha. She listened to his story with a grim expression. "The coin is cursed," she said. "It was forged by a mad alchemist centuries ago, bound to a demon that feeds on the suffering of its victims. There's only one way to break the curse. You must pass the coin to someone who willingly accepts it, knowing the price." Victor's mind raced. He knew what he had to do. That night, he invited his former partner in crime, Marcus, to his mansion. Marcus had always been greedy, and Victor played on that greed. He offered the coin, spinning a tale of untold riches. Marcus, blinded by ambition, took it without hesitation. As soon as the coin touched Marcus's hand, Victor felt the curse lift. His twisted body began to heal, the pain fading. But Marcus wasn't so lucky. His eyes widened as his skin began to rot, his flesh sloughing off in bloody chunks. He screamed, but the sound was cut short as his body collapsed into a pile of gore. The twist. Victor thought he was free. He celebrated with a bottle of expensive champagne, toasting to his newfound fortune. But as he raised the glass to his lips, he felt a cold, metallic weight in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out the coin, its crimson surface gleaming in the dim light. The shadowy figure from his dream appeared once more, its voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Victor? The coin is yours, forever." Victor's screams echoed through the mansion as his body began to dissolve, his flesh melting into a pool of blood. The coin sat atop the pile, waiting for its next victim. Epilogue. The mansion was abandoned. its halls silent except for the occasional drip of blood from the ceiling. But the coin didn't stay there for long. It found its way into the pocket of a curious real estate agent who couldn't resist its eerie allure, and so the curse continued.